Welcome, welcome. I'm Father Mitch Pacwa. Welcome to EWTN Live. We're bringing you guests from all over the world. And tonight, we'll look at one of the really great saints, St. Thomas More. Talk about his life and his writings with two guests who have compiled the most complete picture of St. Thomas More's work to date. Writings not just about the law, but also about theology, political philosophy, poetry, and prose. So before we get to that, we want to speak briefly with EWTN's John Elson about a brand new upcoming program on a popular Marian apparition. John.
Hello, Father.
What have you been up to this time?
Well, it's good to be with you, Father. I wanted to let our viewers know that next Wednesday, March 18th at 10 p.m. Eastern, we'll be presenting an original docudrama entitled Hope, Our Lady of Knock. Now, as we know, on August 21st, 1879, Our Lady appeared, not only just Our Lady, but Our Lady appeared with St. Joseph, the evangelist St. John, and our Lord Jesus in the form of a lamb standing on an altar surrounded by angels. And this miraculous apparition that's been, as you mentioned, approved by the Church was seen by a number of villagers in a small village known as called Knock in County Mayo, which is in the northwestern part of Ireland. And it was seen for a couple hours. What makes this apparition quite unique is that it was completely silent.
Yeah, there's nothing.
No one said anything.
Right.
And so in this docudrama, what we've done is we've invited experts who have studied the apparition to give us certain insights on the apparition, the message that was Our Lady wished to communicate. And we interweave it with some exciting dramatizations as well.
Let's take a quick look at a clip.
It was 1847, and the potato crop failed because we were under foreign rule at that time. Quite a lot of the resources of the country left the country.
I can't believe they're taking food out of the country.
People not knowing whether they'd literally have a roof over their head that evening.
There's nowhere else to go.
Name of the Lord!
Get down! I suppose it's the presence. If she could be present at the cross to deal with that for other people around her at the time, she can be present to us now in dealing whatever suffering that we are going through.
Our Holy Mother has appeared at the chapel. Quickly, come to you, see.
My goodness. What a vision. Why us?
All right. Well, this is pretty good, and we're looking to watch that. It's called This movie's called Hope, Our Lady of Knock. That will be next Wednesday, March 18th, a day after St. Patrick's Day, so it's close to that. It'll be on at 10 p.m. Eastern Time on EWTN, and you can also pre-order your DVD copy. Just go to EWTNRC.com, and it is item number HDOLK, Our Lady of Knock. So we'll be back in a couple of minutes with tonight's guests, so please stay with us. Thank you very much. Thank you, and welcome back. Our guests tonight are two professors who've been working to make the writings and thought of St. Thomas More better understood and more readily available to those who seek to learn more about the patron saint of statesmen and politicians, patron saint of lawyers too. And we could certainly benefit from our politicians and statesmen growing to be a little more holy like St. Thomas More. But I digress. Our guests have compiled St. Thomas More's most important English and Latin works for the first time in a single volume. It is called The Essential Works of Thomas More. And they're here tonight to share about the life of the great saint who at his martyrdom said, "I die the King's faithful servant and God's first." So please welcome the co-editors of the Essential Works of Thomas More, who are also the co-directors of the Center for Thomas More Studies from the University of Dallas. First off, Professor Gerard Wegemer. And from Hillsdale College, joining us via Skype in Ann Arbor, Michigan, is Professor and Dean Stephen Smith. So welcome.
It's a pleasure to be here, Father Mitch. Thank you, Father.
Wonderful to have you. It was great. I knew both of you when we were at University of Dallas together back in the 90s. Stephen, you were working on your PhD at the time?
That's right.
And Dr. Wegemer, you were
teaching English,
giving him the work.
along with others.
Yeah, along with many others. It was a great. The English department, for those who don't know, the English department at University of Dallas is one of its real star departments. There are many wonderful departments there, but that's really one of the great ones. And how did you get going on doing this? I'm going to start off with you, Stephen, because you're so far away. Skype is bringing you to us. So how did you get involved in working on St. Thomas More?
Well, I came to the University of Dallas very interested in Shakespeare, but through a happy twist, I ended up volunteering to help on Jerry's Thomas More in England summer trip, where we took a group of great high school students from around the United States to England to study More's life and writings. And it was really that, beginning work, helping on that trip, helping to teach, and really getting to know More myself that set me on the path to studying him much more seriously.
Oh, great, great. Now, Dr. Wegemer, when did you start to have an interest in St. Thomas, and why?
Well, one of the ironies of my life is that I saw A Man for All Seasons when it came out. I'm that old. And I loved the movie. And I
too.
said, great saint, but not a statesman. Because somehow his silence at the end seemed inadequate for the crisis that had developed. So when I started teaching at UD, I needed to write a book to get tenure. So I was going to write a book on his literature. And I ended up writing a book called Thomas More on Statesmanship, because I realized this man not only was not silent at the end, the reason he was imprisoned was because he was so effectively opposing a very sophisticated program.
So the movie, which is also one of my favorites, is beautifully, beautifully shot. And the English is marvelous. It's just an enjoyable play. But in the movie where he's portrayed as being silent, in fact, he was not.
In his retirement, he wrote 5 books that were extremely influential, addressing indirectly these topics, but that were persuading the opinion makers of England. So Cromwell and Henry had to take a great risk in arresting him to silence him.
And silence him they wanted to do. So, well, cutting off his head is one way to make him silent. This is the way of dictators in general, whether they're crowned kings or not. Now, Stephen, as you've done this work, I know that from talking to Dr. Wegemer that you are going to be continuing on this process of editing new editions. Is that correct?
Well, I mean, there's so much work to do on more going forward that we really need more laborers in the vineyard. He is behind, compared to major thinkers in the English tradition, he's just decades and decades behind in terms of the amount of study that's been done, text being made available. And one of the reasons we made this book available was to really meet that need and to present Thomas More, to the contemporary world in all his fullness and all his richness as a thinker and as a person. And that was the real impetus behind this project.
Now, we've spoken, Dr. Wegemer, and why is Thomas More so important for the present time? What are some of the key issues that you see?
I think one of the most important lesson that's dramatized by putting all 20 of his books together in one volume. It's almost like a complete Shakespeare with all 36 plays. You get a sense of what he did to prepare himself for the end of his life. And this is why to understand more, you need to be a historian, you need to be a philosopher, you need to be very good in theology, you need to be a literary expert. More had a mastery of all these fields. But
that's why you call him a Renaissance man.
Correct.
With no exaggeration.
Correct. He is the quintessential Renaissance man with tremendous wit and humor. He's most famous for his humor. And this is something he cultivates throughout his life in terms of making it effective and charitable. In his earliest works, he quotes the biblical statement that God loves a cheerful giver. And he's very preoccupied with how do you say things in a way that will help people think and reflect and not have their emotional guards put up. You see this in many of his dialogues that he writes. He writes 4 Socratic dialogues. And part of what we can learn from him is this art of conversation and this art of discussion.
I'm very much lost. I don't sense that many of our contemporaries have much of a sense of humor about themselves in particular. They might mock opponents, but I don't sense a good-natured humor about oneself or about the folks around us.
And this is where More had this comprehensive understanding of human nature and of politics. So he spent 17 years after law school immersed in the classics and the church fathers, reflecting on the issues of how do you bring about justice in an imperfect world. And part of that is personal friendship.
Yeah.
He developed a tremendous friendship. He was a friend of Henry VIII even after he retired for the next 2 years. And it was only through people around Henry VIII that More was finally arrested and executed. But he was able to maintain Henry's friendship, even through the most difficult times while he was his counselor.
It's just remarkable. Again, we don't see that so much now. I think we saw it more in our past, but not quite so much. Stephen, are you there?
I am.
Great. In the same question to you, how do you see the importance and relevance of St. Thomas More to our own situation today? And why should people read and be interested in his life?
Well, I think he took very seriously that fundamental question of what the best way is to live a full and complete human life. He studied that, he contemplated it, he prayed about it, and then he struggled to live it very consistently and well right to the end of his life. And I think an example of a life like that is beautiful and invaluable for study. I also think his major themes are just so important for this moment. For example, friendship, civil friendship, education, conscience, integrity, and indeed prayer and piety. So he has so much to offer. He's a man for all seasons, among the most versatile of all the great authors, and his works are a...
Oh, we lost a little sound there. One of the points that he made about education, again, this is something where right now we have a decline in knowledge, even though knowledge is so much more accessible than it had been in any previous period of history. You can get any book you want on the internet, whether you order a hard copy or I frequently download ancient books I just don't have copies of, and I can read them in Greek or in English or Latin, whatever the language might be, and they're there. But at the same time, we have folks not knowing much. He, on the other hand, that is Thomas More, not only was well educated himself, he made his daughters two of the best educated people in Europe.
Well, and he knew how to motivate. And he also knew the importance of education for a full life. He had the phrase that education to be for the full scope of life. And this is where he actually hired tutors from Oxford so his daughters could have the same education his son would have.
Uh-huh.
But he also saw this as part of a free society. Few people know that More was the first person to give a defense of free speech. We have his speech. We include that in the 1,500 pages to give it, again, a full sense of his own contributions to the West. Mm. He understood that every human being was free. And so he believed in parliamentary government. He believed in the consent of the people. Mm-hmm. So he had a very sophisticated understanding of how society flourishes.
And part of the importance of his desire, I mean, he was rather strong and insisted to King Henry VIII to allow free speech in the Parliament, correct?
Correct.
And when we take a look at some of our college campuses, free speech keeps getting shut down.
Well, this is where it comes down to
and
what
that's
is
why
your
we can
view?
use someone like him.
What is your view of the human person? Mm-hmm. And so if you truly believe people are free, the conversation is important, that people should be able to express what they think. Then you're going to cultivate a kind of education that fosters that. But also you're going to cultivate respect for the other person. Mm-hmm. More uses in some of his poetry the image of politics as having the body politic, in which the parts are connected with love. Mm-hmm. And every part should love the other, respect the other.
Exactly, exactly. And this is, again, something that is dearly missing in some of our civil discourse, not only among politicians, but in general in civil discourse, there's not much civility.
And this is where his understanding of education is not just the intellect, which is important, but also the character. And of the character, particularly the understanding that to be a free person, you have to be able to control your own emotions, to govern them. And that you can't have a clear working mind if you don't have a calm soul. So in his earliest and latest works, he talks about the importance of equanimity and developing the habits of mind and character that allow you to listen and to think, and most importantly, to listen to God as he speaks through events and through other people and through the usual means.
Steve, are you back?
I am.
Great. You know, one of the other components of St. Thomas More is the fact that he is a saint. He's not only a great thinker, there were many other thinkers in the Renaissance period, and they're very important in their own ways. But I would never accuse Machiavelli of being a saint. But we do look to Thomas More as a saint. What are some of the elements of the holiness that would distinguish him and his work in statesmanship from Machiavelli in his very effective, and he's very effective still. Machiavelli is much read, but hardly a saint. What makes Thomas More stand out as a saint?
Well, from his earliest writings, you see him taking seriously the question of virtue and the desirability of virtue, the beauty of virtue, and this is not Machiavellian virtù, but this is a full-blooded theological and natural understanding of the great virtues. So his life of Pico, he addresses this subject, and from that earliest work, he talks about cultivating virtue and cultivating a spirit of prayer and cultivating the love of God. And he is consistent on this all the way to the end of his life.
By the way, a lot of folks don't know who Pico is. Who is it that you're referring to there?
Oh, Pico was a Renaissance intellectual philosopher, and Thomas More translated his life into English. And so you can read this biography of this famous Renaissance intellectual through the lens of St. Thomas More in the life of Pico. A lot of people know Pico from the Oration on the Dignity of Man, one of these kind of rallying cry pieces of the Renaissance. But Thomas More shares his story in a different way, and he concludes by offering the reader spiritual counsel and advice, especially on virtue, prayer, and love.
Yeah.
It's also remarkable that from Moore's earliest writings, he addresses God as a very tender, loving Father. And he has that same phrase used in the Tower. He's convinced that God is good. He even writes the signature to his letters to his daughter Meg in the Tower, "Your very tender, loving Father."
By the way, by the Tower,
the prison.
Yeah, this was the Tower of London, where they kept you until they cut your head off.
Right.
Or worse.
Right. So while he was in prison.
Yeah, yeah.
He still has this very positive view of God as a loving Father.
Yes, yeah.
Again, one of the greatest proofs that in adversity is what tests you. What do you really believe? Where is your heart? And it's curious that his last work is actually going to be talking about how do you develop that frame of mind in the worst conditions, in the worst set of fear or travail.
Yeah, no, that's very important. Do you have any other comments on that, Steve?
No, just the importance of More's spirit of preparation, and what the writings really show the reader is his effort, his consistency, and his lifelong cultivation of the virtues that at the end of his life, really shined forth in his imprisonment, trial, and death. And they don't come out of the blue. They are the fruit of a long preparation, long study, long experience, a long struggle. They're a victory.
And when you see his portrait of the family, his family is very famous throughout Europe, and since then. But the family portrait has this full scope of education that's presented. So you have books of learning, you also have prayer books that they're about to read, and it presents the musical instruments of the family in the back. It has the family monkey in the corner. You have this wonderful family scene with granddad there kind of nodding off and sleeping. But you've got this fullness of life that is represented, which he brings in Holbein to paint the family portrait, the most famous portraitist of the Renaissance. And you can see that they've talked together about what to do in terms of this family portrait.
Yeah.
The picture there is actually a sixth generation portrait of after Thomas More's time. But the sketch actually has the many more elements of the family's education.
Yeah, that's a very, very famous painting by Holbein, and you see, I think oftentimes just the part of Thomas More is sort of almost like cut out to focus on him. But he was very much a family man. He had considered a vocation to the religious life.
Correct.
But he chose against it.
He saw clearly that God was asking him another way. And this is also something fascinating about his life. He tests himself at every stage of his life. So he tests himself in terms of deciding which path to go. It's part of the reason he writes the Pico biography. He writes the 12 properties of a lover. It's part of it in rhyme royal poetry. He writes the 12 weapons of spiritual combat. You can see he's actually grappling. And Pico is someone who decides not to get married, although he has affairs outside of marriage. And Moore is clearly thinking and testing himself. Before he accepts to work for Henry VIII, he again tests himself. He doesn't join the King's Court till he's 40, till the family is settled. And I think this is also a very important lesson for people. I mean, he joined at 40, and within 13 years, he was in the highest position. That's because he prepared himself for those 40 years. He also prepared his family to be able to give himself the freedom to serve the king in that regard.
Yeah, and it's important to have that kind of preparation. Something else that is characteristic of not only St. Thomas More, but the saint with whom he shares his feast, St. John Fisher. St. John Fisher was a bishop, and he also was decapitated, and St. Thomas More was martyred. And you look at those two, and you wonder why so few of the other bishops had the courage of St. John Fisher and St. Thomas More to stand up to Henry and Cromwell and the rest.
But this is another very important aspect of what More really contributes to our understanding, because he shows how to make a significant cultural change in some of the most important problems of the era. And he's thinking 100 years ahead of time. He knows he's not going to solve these problems in his own time. So for instance, the bishops are as much a civil ruler as a church ruler.
Right.
More makes £880 a year as the Lord Chancellor, highest office of the land. The Bishop of London makes £1,200 a year. The prime positions are £3,000 a year. These were princes, secular princes,
Right.
princes of the church.
Right.
And many of them couldn't even work in their own diocese. So More foresees not only the importance of having greater freedom in Parliament for discussing secular matters, also the importance of proper roles of church and state. Now, this was going to take a long time to develop.
Yes.
But that's why his role as a historian is also very important, because we have to be able to face problems, realizing we're not going to solve them in our lifetime.
But we have to start
Correct.
with what we can do
Correct.
at this particular point.
Correct.
Now, something that we also have to deal with at this particular point in history is that it's time for a break.
All right.
I just want to let you know that this work is being done in cooperation with the Center for Thomas More Studies. And if you're interested in finding out more about them, you can go to thomasmorestudies.org. thomasmorestudies.org, and find out more. We're going to come back, see if you have some questions and comments, as well as our studio audience. So please stay with us. All right. You ready for some questions?
I'm ready.
All right. Let's start off with Joe. Joe, where are you calling from?
Sunny South Carolina, Father. Good to talk to you.
Good to talk to you, too. Hopefully you won't get all the rain that we've been having. So what is your question, Joe?
Well, could you comment a little more on the importance of family life to Thomas More and how it influenced his work and formed his life? And that's sort of in contradistinction to Henry VIII, I would think.
Yeah,
Wonderful.
great question. I wouldn't call Henry VIII the model family man.
Well, More's model always was God the Father. As God the Father is a father to us, so he saw that he needed to be a father to his children and a spouse to his wife. And he even says in writing that he considers his family obligations first, and that he would give up office if he were not able to fulfill his family obligations. And he says that as a young man who's going through all the decisions you have to make about use of time.
Mm-hmm. Stephen, do you have any other comments on that question?
Oh, just that if you're interested in More's family relationships and More as a father, his correspondence, his letters, which we include such a great collection of in the Essential Works, is the place to go. You can read a letter where he writes back to his children, and he's away from home working, and he writes back to them with advice on how to write well and how to check in on their studies. And little things like that are just wonderful documents where you see, you know, in the midst of all of his pressing duties and work, he took the time to write home to, you know, check in on their composition habits and see how they were doing in their studies. And there's a warmth to these letters that's really great.
Well, an interesting point on that is a number of studies have indicated that if fathers help their kids with the homework, that is one of the best indicators that the children will do well in school. But it's the work of the fathers, and he did that. That's pretty good.
And you can even see in the letters how he cultivates a sense of humor of the children. That
Was
this
that
is very important, that they have this lighthearted but serious approach to their work.
All right. Ma'am, where are you from?
I'm from Minnesota.
Good to have you.
Thank you.
And your question?
Well, I love the movie A Man for All Seasons when I was young, and I'm thinking about what kind of people would look up to St. Thomas More as a patron saint. I'm thinking about holy marriages, but I'm wondering who should be looking to St. Thomas More for their patron.
So maybe put it this way. For whom is St. Thomas More a patron saint? Which groups?
He's been adopted by a lot of people as their
Is
patron
that
saint
right?
because he works really hard for them, and he's a great model for them. Technically, he is the patron saint of politicians, but the technical term used is, in Latin, is gubernator, which means pilot. So, like the pilot of state. We talk about a governor, comes from that word. So
Yes.
anyone who has to pilot storms, More can be their patron. And that's about all of us.
Yeah. Okay. Good. But lawyers certainly
Yes.
also look to him as their patron saint.
That's right.
And in fact, a lot of the Catholic law associations are named
Thomas More
after St.
societies.
Thomas More. And the Red Mass is often, for lawyers and judges, is often in honor of St. Thomas More.
Correct.
All right, we have another caller. Hello, Thomas.
Father?
How are you?
I'm doing fine, Father, and you?
Good, just fine as frog here.
Good.
So
Yeah, I
what
have
can
a
we
question
do for you today? But for those who don't know, it's Thomas from the upper part of eastern Tennessee. So what's your
Got that
question
right,
today?
Father. Yeah, it's for Dr. Wegemer. And I have not read this, I have to confess, which is the book Utopia. But I have read that the many critics of St. Thomas More have called him the conceptual father of communism, long before the 19th century. Can you comment on that, please?
Yes, they missed the joke.
Oh, no. I hate when you have a great line and they don't get the punchline. So what do you mean by they missed the joke?
Utopia is one of the most brilliant pieces of Renaissance literature, written in Latin with quips in Greek. And he poses a tremendous case study of what is the best way of government. But it's a test case that is spoken by Raphael Hythlodaeus, and Hythlodaeus means speaker of nonsense in Greek. So this tale is told, and you're supposed to see that some things are impossible.
It's told by a guy whose name means speaker of nonsense.
Correct. And as you read it, you're supposed to be attracted by some things and curious about others and realize those things are impossible. But it's written in Latin, and he uses all of Cicero's vocabulary. And what he's actually doing in this work is presenting to an English audience of opinion makers the concepts of ancient republican self-government. He talks about liberty. He talks about conditions for liberty. And this is actually a very daring book, but done in such an artful way that people won't immediately see what he's doing. And that's part of the project. From his earliest writings, he's concerned about the dangers of tyranny and the dangers of concentrating too much power in too few hands.
Yeah, and that was a very, very real problem in Europe. And it's a problem that comes and goes in history. And you see in the United States that there's a very small group of extremely wealthy people who have an awful lot of power, and that's risky. Same in Russia, a very few groups, a small number of people have enormous wealth, and they control the society, just like a few kings controlled Europe, and this is highly risky for society. Ma'am? Where are you from?
I'm from South Texas.
Good to have you here. Welcome. And your question?
My question is, St. Thomas More, he paid the ultimate price with his life for refusing to compromise on his values. And he was steadfast in his Christian beliefs, and he would not disobey his conscience. What can present-day politicians learn from him? And what kind of politicians should we be looking for to elect in imitation of St. Thomas More?
Wow.
Well, you actually identified the most important part, and that is conscience. When St. John Paul II made Thomas More patron of statesmen, this is exactly what he pointed to. This is a man who was in passionately love with the truth and was a hero of conscience. And this idea of integrity, that was the other concept that both St. John Paul II and Benedict XVI talked about in England when he visited England. Integrity and conscience. And in terms of an understanding of politics, serving the common good. So that would be the number one criteria, looking for people who serve the common good.
Yeah, I think to keep the first part, that you have this moral integrity from having a well-formed conscience, that you, too often, when people say that they're following their conscience, they really mean they are following their feelings on certain things. And people will even say in the news media, not always the brightest bulbs in the pack, but they will often say, well, what are your feelings about abortion or some other moral issue? Who cares?
Well, see, and this is the importance of education as true education. And
Yes.
that's the full range. There are the liberal arts. It's going to be philosophy, the importance of theology, because you have to have a well-formed conscience.
And that's the thing. It's not about your feelings.
Correct.
in fact, one of the points that St. Thomas More makes is that one's feelings need direction from the mind and the will, that you have to think through these issues and understand why something is right. Why is this a good principle or a bad principle? We have Steve back. Steve, do you have any other reflections on how Thomas More might be a way for us to better understand how to choose our politicians?
Well, I think that the issue, you know, when you study More's life and you review his writings.
Lost him again. Now he's down. Sorry, Steve. Technology is
when you
not...
do review his writings, to pick him up what he
Yeah.
was saying, the care with which he took people's questions and answered them.
Mm-hmm.
He's often criticized. One of the books we didn't include, because it's 1,000 pages, which he writes while he's Lord Chancellor and when he retires, is answering people's questions. He will take a statement and explain it to them. Mm-hmm. Because he realizes, look, the English people are smart people. They want to know the reasons. And and his dialogue is a 400-page dialogue and on the most controversial issues of the period.
Okay. Well, let's go to another caller. Hello, Tony?
Yeah, hi. Greetings from Sioux City, Iowa. I just had a question about something I've been more and more interested in, particularly as I watch the, political events play out in the U.S. here.
Mm-hmm.
The St. Thomas More Society, I was just wondering if you could touch on that, maybe kind of talk about how and why it got formed and whether or not it's specifically Catholic or just generally Christian. I'm assuming it's Catholic, but I didn't know, and I was curious when and how it got formed.
Do you know what he means by this St. Thomas More Society?
There are actually about 60 Thomas More Societies around the country. Most of them are related to lawyer groups of the city. The Center for Thomas More Studies, which Steve and I direct, it's an academic institution whose purpose is to make available More's writings and teachings.
I think that Thomas More's center he's talking about, a society, is an advocacy group for religious people who are getting their rights harassed or taken away.
Correct. That's in Ann Arbor as well.
Yes, yes. Steve, are you back?
I am.
Oh, there you go. Okay, we'll try again. But I don't know if you heard Tony's question, but is Thomas More somebody who can appeal to Catholics only, or can other Christians also benefit from him?
Well, I think insofar as he embodies and emphasizes, personal integrity and personal virtue, he becomes an object of study for everyone. And that's the way that he strikes not only Catholics, but a writer like Jonathan Swift, who wrote Gulliver's Travels, who was an Anglican clergyman, and said More was the man of the greatest virtue these isles ever produced. So there is one example of many, of More's virtue attracting the gaze of someone who's non-Catholic and someone who wonders, how did this guy live the way he lived? How did he proceed the way he proceeded? How did he die the way he died? That was what really got me originally, was when I went to England that first time, I just found myself wondering about Thomas More. What made him tick? How did he make decisions? How did he choose to live? How was he able to endure the storms that overtook so many? And that wonder was really what led me into the study of him. And I think that kind of experience is open to everyone.
Mm-hmm. Did you have any further comments on that?
Well, and that's why he is a Renaissance person, because the Renaissance was trying to go back to the very origins of our culture. First, understand what nature requires. And I think that's perfectly compatible with what we need most now. What is human nature? What are the natural law principles that help every human being make sense of life? And that's certainly going to be what we need in our society, is to understand the fellowship that we all have as citizens. It's curious, one term that Moore emphasizes in his early works is the term leading citizen. This idea that we're all citizens. He never uses the word subjects in his literary works.
Which is what, and the reason that's important is a lot of kings and nobility wanted to emphasize they were the ruler and you are my subject.
Correct.
And you have obligations to me because you're a subject, depending on where you are in the scale. If you're a duke, you're a subject of the king. They emphasize that.
Right.
Thomas More did not.
Correct. He's going back to this understanding that all human beings are equal under God and equal under the law. And this is a very important concept that we all can agree on. But then how do you develop those civic virtues that make that a reality?
Right. And it's, in particular, it's not a Renaissance or medieval problem that sometimes politicians or political leaders, we don't just want to say politicians, but political leaders see themselves as exempt from the law and from prosecution under the law. And Thomas More would not ever go along with that. Everybody's equally liable to prosecution because what's at stake is a principle and not my personal persuasion. That's very different. Steve, do you have any comments on that?
No, I think on the subject of law, another interesting thing in Thomas More is his insight into the way that tyranny abuses law. Now, this comes out in the history of Richard III, for example, where it turns out that sometimes tyrants have great lawyers, and they're willing to take advantage of the law or misuse law to bring about their own ends. And that's another interesting point in Thomas More's understanding.
Yeah. And, you know, that remains ever new, that, you know, that all, you know, by principle, the United States believes that everybody is subject to the law. But we just come across various leaders who tried to get away with not obeying the law and thinking that they're immune. And some business people and wealthy people will also try to see themselves as immune because they're too powerful to fail.
And this is where Thomas More has been very popular in the United States. There are many, many churches, chaplaincies that are named after him. And he's been accepted very much in the United States. He writes about the importance of consent of the governed. He writes about the importance of law. He writes about the equality that we all have under God, as the Declaration of Independence puts it so well. But that's a particular view of human nature that has been articulated and defended.
Well, this is an important thing. Now, you know, one of the things we have just about 2 minutes left or so, and I'd like to pursue a little bit more about if people get your book, what is it that you would expect them to learn or read about? Stephen, let me start off with you. What would people be able to draw from reading the books you've collected in this one volume?
Well, I think between the book and our supporting website and our work on social media, all under Essential More, I think that readers would encounter, maybe for the first time, the full, complete, challenging Thomas More. You know, it's easy to have a partial view of a person, to look at maybe one work or one aspect of a person's life. But what this book really requires is that you try to see the person completely and try to understand why a thinker in the 20th century called him a complete man. Here's a chance to meet him, to study his mind, and to follow him from his youth to the Tower of London and to Tower Hill. And I said, for me, it began with wonder, and then study followed. And in the preparation of this book, at every turn, Jerry and I discovered that Moore was more complex, more captivating, and he was a richer thinker and person than we had understood before. So here's a chance to encounter every aspect of Moore's personality and his writings.
Mm-hmm. And would you find, also say, because you studied him a long time now, partly because you're old enough to have a long time, like myself. You're almost my age. And so do you find that that's also true?
For sure. The idea that here's a life in full. Mm-hmm. And a person who had some of the greatest educators in Europe and some of the greatest opportunities to study, mm-hmm. and how he prepared himself to do what looks so easy at the end.
Okay. Well, Steve, thank you. Sorry about the in and out with Skype. Everybody's learning how to use that still.
Quite all right.
And so very much appreciate Dr. Smith for being with us. Dr. Wegemer also, it's a delight to have you both with us. And I want to give you all a blessing. May Almighty God bless you and keep you, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. You know, we can bring you these programs to inform you about our wonderful saints and their impact on our lives, and so many other programs, because the network is brought to you by you. That's how Mother was inspired. So please keep us in between your gas bill, electric bill, and cable bill. We need your support so we can pay our bills too. God bless. Thank you.